of a background, but I think our viewers would like to ask this question. What has been your journey as a sustainability analyst? And to also add on, what inspired you to take up this journey?
Oh, so let me begin with a cliche. As Shruti mentioned before in the prelude, that I'm an architect in training. So it was pretty much a calling. It did start from the days of putting Lego blocks together. So my apologies to everyone who was expecting a more cutthroat answer, but yes, there is romanticism there. So I was always called to do architecture in that sense, but something that during my undergrad training, something that a professor of mine said struck me and haunted me for the rest of my 5 years. He said that whatever building you make is a scar on the planet. And somehow that didn't sit well with me. I thought, no, I don't want to be designing scars. So, and that was in the third year. And since then, I tried to find ways to make buildings less of a burden on the planet. And what came back to me strangely was this optional assignment that we did in the ninth grade called a mock EIA, Environmental Impact Assessment, for an imaginary site. And I remember being very interested in putting numbers and tangible aspects to how much you are benefiting the environment or degrading it. And then I thought, okay, maybe that's the way to go. Maybe to tangible, to
Quantifying
make
the
objectives of how well or how badly your building is impacting the planet is the way to make it less of a scar. So that began my quest towards looking for more formalized education that trains me for this, because unfortunately in the undergrad that I did in Bombay, we had a very scant introduction towards climatology, environment, and aspects of the built environment dealing with climate and sustainability as such. So the specialized course that I did in AA was certainly an eye-opening one. And there we started to learn how to use simulation tools, analysis to quantify through numbers, very, very hardcore numbers, which has put a lot of people off, and it's very software oriented. But whoever's looking forward to it, I promise you the output is very pretty. So that cemented my belief that this is what I want to do. And at that point, I didn't know that this is called being a sustainability consultant. And I was looking for opportunities where I could practice this in its absoluteness. And TerraWord is the firm that both of us met and practiced this sort of architecture for close to 4 years. Was definitely one avenue where we could thoroughly rely on sustainability principles. And so that's where I officially realized that I'm a sustainability consultant. And yeah, that was the
We should
journey
give a quick
until
hi
then.
to everyone in Terra where it is.
Hi everyone. I
Hi.
saw Mansi join in. So
Oh,
Mansi, if you're
hi.
watching, um, a little shout out to you, because if Shruti was kind enough to say that I've been of any inspiration, then equal share goes to everyone who is working at that company. Many words can be said about that experience, but that's a completely different podcast
Session,
altogether.
right? Shruti, we'll get on to our first question for the day.
Sure.
Um, so I don't know if you felt it, but often when people talk about climate change on a daily basis, they mostly refer to the average temperature rising, like
Mhm.
the planet is warming up. But yes, that is the major story behind it. But then there are other major impacts like urban floods, landslides, cold, like cold winds, cyclones, air pollution. Um, so often people don't talk about these major impacts if you look at it, especially when it comes to Indian cities, because we are very vulnerable. A, because we are a developing nation. B,
Mhm.
urbanization, it's rapid urbanization. And also, um, let's face it, there are other things that we need to take care. So when you look at this from the Indian context, in the coming years, what do you think will be the major climate change impact that our cities will face? But adding, I know every cities will have different impacts considering the geography, social, political scenario. But
Mhm.
what do you think will be our situation coming in the coming years?
So that's a really interesting question because then that gets us to the idea of the IPCC. And for those who are uninitiated to this landmark organization, it is one of the most prolific and prominent bodies that conduct wide-scale studies, literature analysis on the field of mitigation, adaptation, and physical climate sciences. So, in the recent IPCC reports that we've been lucky to have a whole cluster of, um, some of the things that cities per se will definitely be impacted by are the rising temperatures, as you had mentioned, and there seemed to be a dichotomy in the things that cities could experience. Now, coastal cities will be plagued by coastal flooding, the sea level rise, increase in storms, which are all exacerbated by ocean temperatures, fluctuations in equilibrium that happen due to Earth system analysis. And I'm not going to get too technical or pedantic about it, but there are two aspects to this, something called as TCR and ECS. So ECS is equilibrium sensitivity, climate sensitivity, and TCR is the transient response that Earth systems have. So everything we do, every amount of emission or every um, anthropometric act that we do impacts the systems in two ways, either in a long-term equilibrium that happens through ECS or in a very short term. So when these two factors are put together with the physical changes that cities will be plagued with, um, we will see more long-term issues such as water scarcity, extremes of temperature in both um, heat as well as increasing lower temperatures, high diurnal variance, and then you have inland flooding, you have pressures on ecological systems, there are pressures on socio-economic systems. So, and when you compile this or read in junction with the fact that Indian cities are largely coastal. Some of the major metropolitans that we have are largely coastal, which unfortunately are also home to some of the most prolific informal settlements. So, cities that are rampantly growing in terms of urbanization, like Bombay, or for that matter, on the other side, Chennai, are most likely to experience coastal flooding, increased storms, increased weather phenomena, but when coupled with the fact that these geological hazards, hydrogeological hazards that happen on a large scale in rapidly urbanizing centers with large scale of informal settlements, this starts to then put pressure on urban systems like water, sanitation, transport, um, intercity transport, housing, health. So cities in India, owing to their geographical conditions, and of course, as we move further to the north, there are other issues like air pollution, like you had
Yeah,
mentioned, the increasing
urban heat
dismal
island effect.
air quality, because drought, water scarcity, which will then impact food security. So as the geography of the country changes, which on one level we are blessed to have such a varying geography, but on the other hand, that just means that our mitigation and adaptation strategies for urban centers have to be that much more bespoke.
Specific. Yeah. Um, Interesting that you mentioned health. If you see the recent IPCC report stresses a lot about health and also about psychological well-being. mental well-being. So what is your take on that? And do you see that it's already happening?
So, interestingly enough, UCL has a very solid study that they are taking on in partnership with several other institutions about the mental well-being aspect of climate change and how, of course, there are physiological factors like increased exposure to heat stress
Yes.
and which could lead to fatigue,
Mm.
uh, being tired all the time, being exposed to sick building syndrome, being exposed to polluted air. These are physiological symptoms of climate change. And of course, in more humid places, when there is a sea level rise, increase in humidity, a surge of storms, it could also lead to the proliferation of further pandemics. I don't want to sound
Mm.
dystopic or pushing any sort of post-apocalyptic zombie era agendas, but unfortunately, diseases that are proliferated by these circumstances will be exacerbated by increasing climate change risks. But the other aspect to it is the mental well-being aspect, which is still being studied. But UCL has alluded to this, and the American Psychological Association also mentioned that people who, almost 45% of people who are exposed to an extreme climate event show symptoms of PTSD. And this is more common among marginalized groups, among people of color, among women, among children, the elderly. So sensitive, vulnerable groups are almost 54% more likely, according to the study, to show symptoms of grave PTSD when exposed to extreme climate events. And I think it was recently in the news, maybe 2 days ago, that India experienced one of the hottest March
March. True.
temperatures in what, 120 years,
Years.
something maddening like that. And closer to where I am, Spain and Portugal are experiencing drought, and in England it's a joke: if you don't like the weather, just wait for 15 minutes. So I mean, weather is posing weather, climate are becoming unpredictable factors. And interestingly enough, there have also been studies where these shifting, unpredictable climate events are pushing the younger population towards what is known as climate anxiety. And it's a very recent phenomena where they
Hmm.
are unsure of a future where these events are going to multiply in frequency and intensity, and they are unsure as to, in the political cog of things, how much they can implement change. So mental health and associated illnesses are something that I unfortunately think are yet to be explored, but will definitely show up as we become more and more accustomed in a sad way, accustomed to these frequent occurrings of climate change.
So you had mentioned briefly regarding how the impacts affect women, marginalized societies more.
Mhm,
It is true. The impacts are not same for everyone,
mhm,
especially in the South Asian belt. Um, you can clearly see how low income groups are more the first hand victims of climate change.
mhm.
What
Yes.
is your take on that?
So, um, a simple example: a country that is heavily reliant on agriculture as their economy, such as ours, will be disproportionately impacted in terms of food security. But then you just have to take one step back. Who's growing that? Who are the people who are bringing that food to us? And if security is being taken away from us at the end of that chain, then who's being impacted at the production stage? So when a country as large as ours, with a population that large, who are dependent on agriculture for their income, for their stability, for their status, for their social, for putting themselves on the social cadre, far more. I read an article recently that uh, uh, you know uh, tickle my gray matter. It said that rat pickers and waste haulers in India are going to be disproportionately affected by increasing waste due to climate change. And that was something that got me thinking. There are specific occupations that are so reliant on the climatic conditions being appropriate for them. But when those climatic conditions are impacted, then there are probably several invisible occupations right in front of our daily in front of our lives on a daily basis that we aren't even aware of. Another interesting thing that popped up in the article was mango farmers. Since it's not just a cash crop, it is a symbol of pride for us. Our mangoes, and you can see it when there's Indian mangoes in the market. You can see that the Indian diaspora in London will flock towards it. Whether or not there are equally good South American or Philippines or Indonesian, it's a symbol of pride for us. But mango showers, which at some point was a more natural marker for the end of a harvest season, is now being upset, and there lies a very high chance that crops which are phenomenally dependent on the finicky precision of climate and irrigation and rainfall happening in the way that it might be impacted, and with that we will see a certain populace becoming even more marginalized because their entire life, their identity, their occupation, the trade that they teach their children are all going to be impacted by it. Similar to what I would say are the Koli fisher folk in Bombay, because these crafts are also passed down via generations. So when you impact the skill and livelihood from a hydrogeological phenomena, there's nothing much to pass. So the questions of what is being marginalized even within a marginalized community is something that we haven't come to really wrap our head around or even understand in a nuanced fashion that we should.
This session cannot be complete without we touching about two major topics. One is mitigation, the second one is adaptation.
Right.
So for our viewers, mitigation means the steps that we take towards reducing climate change, if you put it simply. And then adaptation, finding measures so that we can slowly adapt to the changing climate, so that we are ready, we are future proofing ourselves for the planet that's yet to come. So when you look at the Indian context, especially when there are initiatives under smart cities, there's a huge, mostly these mitigation measures are around urban mobility or solid waste management, city beautification. But when you look at the real picture, what do you think are, say, one or two mitigation measures that would actually help our country and our cities right now?
So if we again go back to IPCC reports, there are some usual suspects which make cities are, let me add a little preamble to that. Cities are highly complex systems. They're the resultant of many urban systems coming together, and in order to tackle mitigation from a city perspective, we have to start to delineate what aspect of the city is most um, contributes the most to, let's say, emissions for now. So let's start with transport and mobility, as you were talking about. Those mitigations relating to transport are probably the third highest, and emissions relating to buildings directly, maybe somewhere around 20% or so. But when you look at them from an indirect, when you look at these aspects from an indirect perspective, that is right from energy production. How is, if we have batteries, if we have a network of electric cars and electric batteries and charging stations, what form of electricity or what form of electric production is supplying them is another question to ask, because the largest contributor actually to emissions and CO2 on a city level is energy production. And then indirectly, buildings followed by transport become the most and the second most when you're looking at what kind of energy is being supplied to run the systems in these two specific aspects of cities. So when we talk about buildings, there are two ways that the built environment contributes to emissions. One is embodied, or rather the emissions that are embedded, as the word would suggest, within a building without it having to function. So in its materials, in the way the materials are brought to site, in the processes that are used in order to produce certain aspects of the built environment. So these are the which um, also affect transport. So these things are embedded within processes, and then we have the actual lifespan of the building as it operates, hence the name operational energy. So which takes up a large chunk of emissions from the built environment perspective. Similarly, what kind of fuel are you using for your transportation throughout its lifetime? So, mitigation systems can impact several aspects of cities in terms of reducing emissions in these two aspects of the urban space, and increasing efficiency throughout the lifespan of several systems. So by increasing efficiency in transport, you would be using electric vehicles, increasing fuel efficiency, decreasing emissions. In the embodied stage of things, you start looking at what are the fuels that are used in the manufacturing processes of said vehicles. Similarly, in the built environment, how are we making the systems, the cooling, the heating systems, lighting, equipment? How are we making the operation of these systems more efficient? And are the materials that we're using inherently low carbon? So by looking at it from these two aspects, we can tend to tackle mitigation on both levels, and so which is called life cycle analysis. So mitigation tends to rely on largely increasing efficiency in cities, is how I would like to. Of course, there's a secondary aspect of when you have reduced uh, consumption, when you have tackled efficiency, and there is still a spillover of emissions that need to be taken care of. It is only then and only then that we start looking at things like CCS, which is carbon capture and storage. And this is both an industrially academic informed opinion and also a bit personal one of mine. When technologies like BCCS and CCS are not as tested, relying on them solely for the sake of mitigation is not a great solution to go for, even urban or national level wise. And so that is the process that most cities ideally should follow for mitigation.
Like you rightly mentioned, mitigation can only come halfway. The rest, we need to adapt. We need to look into ways how can we future-proof our planet, as simply as that. So again, coming to the context of Indian cities, because we are sticking to that topic, though I know it's unfair for me to ask, what are the adaptation measures? I say I cannot ask, but still, according to your opinion, what are the major adaptation measures that Indian cities need to look at it today?
Okay, since you've already realized what a honest task this question is, I'm going to try to keep it as encompassing as possible and say adaptation plans. So national, state level, city level plans that are, but having said that, these are all very top down approaches that I'm talking about. These plans have to be informed by a very bottom up, community driven understanding the context. Let's again, since I'm from Bombay, it's easy for me to pull on these examples. um, I did a study last year, and fingers crossed the paper should come out soon. The study focused on the gaps in the scales of adaptation plans and measures. So the community that would be largely affected by rising sea levels, increasing storms in a coastal city like Bombay would be the Koli fisher folk, whose entire livelihood, generational occupation, cultural, socio-cultural identities are tethered to the sea. So when you take that away, when you create a giant question mark in the predictability of fishing timetables, availability of fish stocks, increasing food scarcity, then an entire population or an entire community becomes immediately marginalized by the sheer nature of their relationship to the sea. So, in that study, what came to light was that there is no scale where these concerns are addressed, or where these concerns slowly start to plug up and inform the larger frameworks. So, I suppose that would be the case across Indian cities, where if we go to the north, forest and forestry related, there are several communities who have a very symbiotic relationship with the forest and rely on the forest for livelihood. And given a framework within which to adapt, would be able to adapt to increasing pressures, contribute to increasing the forest coverage, form a relationship with forest ecosystems within a framework of adaptation and maybe even mitigation. So I suppose my one sentence takeaway would be to have a more nuanced understanding of how the community level or the impacted group level starts to feed into these larger scale framework systems, because they are there. We also tend to be a little cruel in underestimating the existence of systems itself. They are there, but it's not as robust as we would like them to be. The robustness of frameworks should allow for these stories to come up and for marginalized groups to become part of. For example, again, going back to the Koli folk, they have devised their own storm warning systems purely because there is no scope for a warning system for approaching storms in a turbulent coastal condition like Bombay. So if you use existing community knowledge, such as this more informal indigenous information system, it's only going to make our frameworks that much richer. So the policy frameworks that are fed from below are probably implemented above, something of a maybe like a, I don't know, I'm missing the word, uh, like a like a sinusoidal wave somewhat coming in between. Something of that nature would really solidify the systems and frameworks through which adaptation can then occur. Because if we get into tiny adaptation measures, they're going to be like mitigation measures, too specific to the geography of a vast country like ours. But there is great potential in the idea of using bottom-up information, indigenous knowledge to inform pre-existing larger frameworks.
Well said, Shruti. That was a very valid
Thank you,
point.
thank you very much.
So I think we are nearing to the end of this session.
Oh wow, that did not feel like an hour.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad we got this topic, this discussion started. And thank you for being such a sport and saying yes to me right away. And
Oh, no, never. I mean, like, I would gladly do this again with the rest of the team and fight them on points where we have had bones of contentions before, and in being highly optimistic about what top-down approaches can achieve. I will always be a propounder of the middle scale, which is the toughest to achieve. But again, just to finish off, thanks a ton for having me, and I will gladly do this again in a heartbeat.
me too, Shruti. Thank you so much.
Thanks a
Good
ton,
night.
and I hope the audience has had fun. Good night.
If there's any question, we can take a question. If there's any question,
Oh,
we'll
sure,
wait for a
sure,
minute.
sure, sure.
Let us
No worries. I should admit I have no idea on how these finicky technologies work, so I will leave that to you.
Thank you, Tanvi.
Thanks a lot,
She
Tanvi.
says
I'm
it's
glad you found it interesting. Wish we could have had you too, actually.
soon. We should do such sessions more.
Oh,
More
yes,
of
yes,
it.
yes. The more
I
the
think
merrier.
it's okay. I think it's let's take a call, and thank you,
Okay.
Shruti. Thank you once again. And
Thanks a lot, and looking forward to the rest of the sessions you're going to have with a variety of other interesting
thank
thoughts
you
and
so much.
people.
Thank you for getting it started. Thank you for being my first guest.
Oh, always, always.
Thank you.
Thanks a
Bye.
ton. Bye. Everyone, take care. Stay safe.